A ship came from the stars on a Tuesday morning. It did not come with fire or noise. It did not come with the kind of drama that humans had always imagined in their old movies and cheap paperback novels. It simply appeared in the sky above the Atlantic Ocean, large and silver and very, very still. It hung there like a thought that the universe had not yet finished thinking, and the whole world stopped to look at it. Radar stations picked it up first, then satellites. Then every phone on the eastern coast of the United States lit up with notifications, news alerts, and panicked texts from relatives who lived nowhere near the coast. Within 20 minutes, fighter jets were scrambled. Within 40 minutes, those jets were recalled because the ship had already broadcast a message, in clean, careful English, asking to speak with someone in charge. It took 3 days to arrange the meeting. They waited. The one who came down to speak was called Valith. He was tall, thin, and the color of old ash. He had 4 arms, 2 of which he kept folded close to his body, the way a person might hold their hands in their lap during a formal dinner. His eyes were large and gold, and they moved slowly, taking in everything. He wore a long robe the color of deep water, and he walked with the careful, deliberate steps of someone who had done this before, landed on strange planets, talked to strange creatures, asked for strange things. He met with the UN Security Council in a building in New York City. The room was full of people in suits. There were translators, though they turned out to be unnecessary. There were soldiers standing along the walls, though Valith did not seem to notice them. He sat down at the long table, folded 2 of his hands together, and began to speak. He introduced himself as an ambassador of something called the Galactic Conclave. He explained that the Conclave was a group of over 200 species who had, over thousands of years, built a civilization together out in the stars. They had laws. They had trade. They had art and music, and things that had no human translation. They had, by most measurements, built something remarkable. And now, something was destroying it. He called them the Vreth. He did not describe them in great detail at first. He said only that they were a hive-minded species, that they moved like a single organism, even when spread across hundreds of ships and thousands of bodies, and that they had been cutting through the outer edges of conclave space for over 60 years. Every world they touched, they consumed. Every species they encountered, they absorbed or erased. The conclave had been fighting them for decades, and the war had become a slow, grinding nightmare with no end in sight. The humans at the table listened carefully. Some of them did not blink. Valith explained that the conclave had recently become aware of Earth through long-range observation. They had studied the planet for several years before making contact. They knew about human civilization, its history, its languages, its politics. They knew that humans had armies. They knew that humans had wars. This was, he said carefully, precisely why the conclave had come. They wanted soldiers. Not just any soldiers. They wanted trained, professional military personnel. People who knew how to follow orders, hold defensive positions, protect supply lines and civilian populations. The conclave's own member species were not naturally warlike. Most of them had not fought a real war in centuries. They had peacekeeping forces, border patrols, ceremonial guards. None of it had prepared them for the Vreth. What they needed, Valith said, was someone who understood the business of fighting. They were asking for 10,000 human soldiers, deployed to the Vreth front on a temporary basis, with full pay and compensation arranged through conclave resources. In return, Earth would receive technology, medicine, and open access to conclave trade networks. The offer was generous. Valith presented it with the quiet confidence of someone who expected a long negotiation. The humans talked among themselves for 2 days. On the 3rd day, they came back to the table and said yes. They agreed to the terms with only minor adjustments. They said they would have volunteers ready within 3 weeks. Valith nodded and thanked them. He thought the meeting had gone very well. He did not yet understand the word volunteers. He learned it the next morning, when the news broke across every television channel and every website and every street corner on the planet. The human governments were not drafting soldiers. They were not selecting units or assigning regiments. They were simply putting out a call and asking who wanted to go. Valith watched the news coverage from inside his ship. He had a screen that showed human broadcasts, and he sat in front of it with 2 of his hands pressed together and 2 resting on his knees, watching. The reporters were standing in front of recruitment offices. Behind them, in the streets, there were lines. Long lines, very long lines. Not just in one city, in every country. Men and women, and people of every age that could reasonably be called an adult. Some wore old military jackets with patches on the sleeves. Some came in civilian clothes, with nothing but a bag over their shoulder. Some came alone, and some came in groups, laughing and slapping each other on the back, like they were going to a game rather than a war. By the end of the first day, the number of applicants had passed 2 million worldwide. By the end of the second day, it was over 5 million. Valith turned away from the screen and sat quietly for a long time. He was a diplomat who had visited 43 worlds in his career. He had seen species that were aggressive and species that were peaceful, and species that were somewhere in between. He had a good eye for reading a civilization's character. He told himself that the large number of volunteers simply reflected the size of Earth's population. It was a demographic fact, nothing more. Humans were curious. Humans liked adventure. The chance to travel to the stars was exciting. This was all perfectly normal. He told himself this several times. It helped, a little. But there was one image from the broadcast that he could not stop thinking about. It was a brief clip, only a few seconds long. A woman standing near the front of a recruitment line, somewhere in a cold country, with gray skies behind her. She was not young. She had short gray hair and a wide, flat face and calm eyes. She was wearing a jacket with a unit patch on the shoulder that the translator identified as a special operations insignia. A reporter had pushed a microphone toward her and asked why she was there. She had looked at the camera for a moment without expression. Then she had said, simply and quietly, "Heard something out there needs killing." Then she had turned back to face the line, and that was all. Valith watched that clip 3 times. He was not sure why. He told himself it was nothing. Just one strange, small comment from one human out of billions. He closed the screen and went to prepare for the deployment. Outside, the lines kept growing. Commander Cyrith had been told that the humans would arrive at Staging Point Kelos on the 14th day of the 3rd cycle. She had been told there would be 10,000 of them. She had been given files, thin files, poorly translated, pulled from intercepted human broadcasts and old observation records that described the human military as disciplined, hierarchical, and effective within the limited scope of planetary warfare. She had read the files. She had prepared a welcome. She had arranged for proper accommodations, briefing rooms, and a ceremonial greeting, as was standard for all new Conclave auxiliary forces. She was not prepared for what came off the shits. The first transport docked at 0600, and the doors opened, and the humans walked out. And Cyrith stood at the end of the boarding ramp with her 4 staff officers and watched them come. She had seen images of humans before. She knew they were bipedal, that they were soft-skinned, that they lacked the natural armor or size of many species. She had expected them to look small, fragile even. Some of them were, in fact, not large, but they moved in a way that made size feel like the wrong thing to be measuring. They walked the way water moves when it is looking for a way through rock. Not fast, not aggressive, just always finding the path that took them exactly where they wanted to go. Their eyes moved constantly, taking in the ceiling, the walls, the exits, the positions of every person in the room. Some of them were smiling. Several of them were already talking quietly to each other, in voices too low to translate, looking at the staging area the way a builder looks at an empty lot, not seeing what was there, but seeing what could be done with it. One of Cyreth's staff officers leaned close and whispered, "They don't look frightened." Cyreth did not answer because she was busy watching a large human male stop near the entrance, set down his bag, and with no particular urgency at all, count every conclave soldier visible in the docking bay. She knew that was what he was doing. He moved his eyes in a pattern that was methodical and unhurried, and when he was done, he picked up his bag again and walked on without changing his expression. She introduced herself. She gave the welcome speech. The humans listened politely. Then their commanding officer stepped forward to introduce himself. And that was when Cyreth first met Sergeant Major Dana Voss. Voss was not the biggest human present. She was a woman of middle age, neither tall nor short, with gray-streaked hair cut close to her head, and a face that had the particular quality of having seen a great deal, and decided that most of it was manageable. She shook Cyreth's hand, a human greeting gesture that involved gripping each other's hands briefly, which Cyreth had practiced, but still found strange, and said that she was glad to be there, and that she and her people were ready to get to work whenever the commander was ready. Cyreth said she would provide briefings in the morning. She would give them time to rest first. She said her people didn't need rest yet, and that if it was all the same, she'd like to review whatever tactical data was available on the Vreth as soon as possible. Cyreth said she would arrange it. Then she went back to her office and reviewed the personnel files that had come with the humans. And the feeling she had not had a name for on the docking ramp got considerably worse. She had expected soldiers, trained professional infantry with ranks and units, and structured chains of command. What the humans had sent was something considerably harder to categorize. There were soldiers among them, yes. But the selection criteria that the humans had used, if there were selection criteria, which Cyreth was beginning to doubt, seemed to have prioritized something other than obedience and formation discipline. The files were full of specialized training designations that Cyreth had to have her translation system work through carefully. And even then, many of them came out as approximations that did not map cleanly onto anything the Conclave used. There were people who had spent years in jungles, mountains, and deserts on Earth, learning to operate alone or in tiny groups far behind hostile lines. There were people who had been trained to enter defended buildings and eliminate every threat inside in the span of seconds. There were trackers who could follow a trail across bare rock. There were people whose job titles, translated loosely, came out as something like professional long-distance killer. There was a group of 12 humans whose files were almost entirely blank, with a single notation that read, "Activities classified." Her translation system flagged the word classified 14 times in the first 100 files. A third of them had combat experience in something called asymmetric warfare. When she asked her system to define this, it returned a description that amounted to the practice of winning fights against larger, better-equipped opponents through unconventional and unpredictable means. Cyreth sat with that definition for a while. She called up Valeth on a secure channel. He was 3 star systems away, already moving on to other diplomatic business. She told him carefully that the humans who had arrived were perhaps not what they had discussed with the Security Council. Valeth asked if they seemed dangerous. Cyreth thought about the human on the docking ramp, counting soldiers. She thought about the files. She thought about Voss's flat, calm eyes, asking for tactical data, before she had even been shown her quarters. She said that they seemed very professional. Valeth said, "That was good," and ended the call. In the morning, Cyreth brought Voss to the tactical briefing room and laid out everything the Conclave had on the Vreth. Their numbers, their movement patterns, their assault formations, their communication structure, their rate of advance, the history of every engagement the Conclave had fought against them in 60 years of war, every defensive line that had held and every one that had broken. She expected questions about supply logistics, about reinforcement schedules, about where the humans would be positioned relative to Conclave units. Voss looked at the data for 6 minutes. Cyreth timed it. 6 minutes for 60 years of war. Then Voss looked up and said, "They don't change their tactics mid-fight. Once they commit to an assault pattern, they run it to completion regardless of what happens. Every engagement in your records shows the same thing." Cyreth said yes, that was correct. The hive mind optimized before engagement, but was slow to re-optimize during one. It was one of the Vreth's few consistent weaknesses, though the Conclave had never found a reliable way to exploit it, because their own forces could not move or adapt quickly enough. Voss nodded slowly. She tapped the edge of the table once with 2 fingers. "That's a problem," she said. "For them." She said it the way a person says something that is so obvious it barely needs saying, the way a doctor might say a patient has a curable condition, simple, settled, already halfway to a plan. Cyreth looked at her for a long moment. "You are not frightened," Cyreth said. It came out less like a question than an observation she needed to say out loud to make real. Voss seemed to consider the statement seriously. "Of the Vreth?" She tilted her head slightly. "We haven't seen them yet." "They have destroyed 14 worlds," Cyreth said. "I know," Voss said. "I read the files last night." She paused. "All of them." Cyreth did not say anything. "We should talk about terrain," Voss said, and turned back to the map. The Vreth came on the 9th day. There was no warning, which was not unusual. The Vreth did not send warnings. They did not negotiate, threaten, or announce. They simply arrived, the way a fire arrives. There is no fire, and then there is, and the only question that matters is how much it intends to burn. The sensors at Staging Point Kelos picked up the Vreth probe force at 0340 local cycle time. It was a small force by Vreth standards, roughly 800 units, a combination of assault drones and infantry-class organisms bred specifically for ground combat. Probe assaults were standard Vreth procedure. They were not meant to take ground. They were meant to test, to measure, to find the soft spots in a defense, so that the real attack could cut directly through them. The Conclave garrison at Kelos had survived 3 previous probe assaults. They had done it by pulling back to fortified positions, taking their losses, holding the line, and letting the probe exhaust itself against prepared defenses. It was not a winning strategy. It was a surviving strategy. There was a difference, and everyone at Kelos knew it. General Hosvar, the ranking Conclave officer at the station, called an emergency command meeting and laid out the defensive plan. He was a Talvani, like Cyreth, gray-blue and precise, with a long career of holding positions that could not be held and losing them slowly instead of quickly. He was respected. His plan was sensible. Cyreth had seen it work before, in the way that a slow retreat works. It costs less than a rout. Cyreth sat at the back of the room and watched Voss listen to the plan. Voss was quiet through the entire briefing. She sat with her arms folded and her eyes on the tactical map. And she did not interrupt, and she did not object. When Hosvar finished and asked if the human contingent understood their assigned position, the eastern perimeter, a secondary defensive line, Voss said yes, and thanked him for the briefing. Then she left the room, and Cyreth followed her into the corridor. "You disagree with the plan," Cyreth said. Voss glanced at her. "The plan is fine for what it's trying to do." "But?" Cyreth asked. Voss stopped walking. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at Cyreth. "Defensive strategies against this enemy teach it where your walls are. Every probe that survives goes home with information. The next probe knows more. The attack after that knows everything. She paused. You've been training them for 60 years. Cyreth opened her mouth and then closed it. We're not going to hold the eastern perimeter, Voss said. With respect to General Hosvar. She started walking again. We'll be in the field. She said that was outside the assigned parameters. She said General Hosvar had given a clear order. She said there were protocols, command structures, agreements between the Conclave and Earth about how the human contingent would be deployed. Voss paused without turning around. You want us to fight, she said, or you want us to stand in a line and bleed? Cyreth did not answer. We'll be in the field, Voss said again, and walked away. At 0520, the Vreth probe force crossed the outer marker. The Conclave units pulled back to their fortified positions, as planned. Sensors tracked the advance in clean, terrible lines, 800 units, moving in the coordinated, mindless flow that Vreth always moved in, like water filling a space. They hit the outer automated defenses and pushed through them the way they always did, taking losses and not caring, because the hive did not feel individual loss the way a thinking creature does. Every unit that fell was just a number subtracting from a total. The total was still large enough. They moved toward the eastern perimeter. Cyreth was in the command post, watching the sensor grid, her hands folded in front of her, because she needed them to be doing something, and there was nothing to do. The human markers on the grid had moved out of their assigned position 40 minutes ago. They had spread outward, moving into the rough terrain between the station and the Vreth approach, a stretch of broken ground with rocky outcroppings and low gullies, and the wrecks of old supply transports that had been bombed in a previous raid. Then the human markers had done something that made the sensor technician sit up straight and say something in his own language that Cyreth did not catch. They had gone dark. Not destroyed, not jammed, just gone. Offline, silent. Every tracking signal, every communication ping, every locator beacon that should have been broadcasting the position of 10,000 soldiers had simply stopped. The Vreth probe force entered the eastern approach zone. The sensor grid showed the Vreth moving forward. It showed the empty terrain. It showed nothing else. For 11 minutes, the command post was completely silent, except for the hum of equipment and the quiet breathing of officers who were watching a sensor grid that was telling them almost nothing. Then, the Vreth signals began to disappear. Not all at once, one at a time, or in small clusters of 2 and 3, the Vreth unit markers simply stopped transmitting. The Vreth did not alter their approach pattern when this happened. They could not. The hive mind had committed to the assault formation, and it ran that formation the way a machine runs a program, straight through to the end, regardless of the inputs that changed along the way. The inputs kept changing. In 30 minutes, 204. She was eating something from a small sealed package, a human food ration, with the unhurried manner of someone who had finished a task that had gone more or less as expected. Behind her, in groups of 2 and 3 and 5, other humans were coming back. Some were speaking quietly to each other. Some were cleaning weapons. One very tall man was laughing at something, low and easy, the way people laugh when they are tired but satisfied. Voss walked to Cyreth's console. She set something down on it. It was a collection of small devices. Cyreth recognized them as Vreth communication nodes, the biological mechanical units the hive used to coordinate its probe forces and transmit battle data back to the main fleet. She counted them without touching them. There were many. We left 2 alive, Voss said, opening her ration pack again. Pulled their communication nodes so they can't report details. They'll make it back to the main fleet and report that the probe failed. She chewed, swallowed, looked at Cyreth. You want them scared before the real fight. Fear makes the hive hesitate. Hesitation is a gap. We'll use it. General Hosvar had come out of his station at the far end of the room. He was standing very still, looking at the empty sensor grid where 800 Vreth had been an hour ago. One of the Telvanni officers near Sirith leaned toward his colleague and said very quietly, "What did we bring to this war?" Sirith heard him. She did not have an answer. She looked at Voss, who was still eating her ration pack and looking at the maps of Vreth fleet positions, with the calm, attentive expression of someone who had already moved on to the next problem. Sirith thought about the 60 years of war, about 14 destroyed worlds, about every probe force that had ever come back with information that made the next attack worse. She thought about the sensor grid going dark. She thought not one of them survived to report anything useful. And for the first time, in a very long time, she felt something other than dread. She was not yet sure what it was. She would figure out the name for it later. Right now, Voss was asking for updated Vreth fleet positions, and Sirith pulled herself together and got back to work. The 2 Vreth that came home from the probe at Kelos brought almost nothing useful with them. Their communication nodes had been removed before they were released, which meant they could not transmit detailed data. What they could do, what every Vreth organism could do, regardless of damage or interference, was feed raw sensory experience back into the hive. Feeling, impression, the blunt, wordless report of a body that had been somewhere and returned. What the hive received from those 2 survivors was not tactical information. It was something the Vreth Overmind had not processed from one of its own units in over 3,000 years of conquest. Fear. Not the calculated threat assessment that the hive used to evaluate dangerous environments. Not the pain response of units under fire. Something older and less structured than that. The 2 survivors had moved through the broken ground at Kalos, and something had been in the dark with them. Something that moved without sound, struck without warning, and left no pattern the hive could analyze. And what they brought home in their nervous systems was the raw animal experience of being hunted. The Overmind processed this for exactly the amount of time a being like the Vreth ever takes to process an unexpected input. Then it did what it always did. It escalated. Within 6 cycles, the largest Vreth war fleet assembled in that region of space was moving toward the Kalos system. Sirith's long-range sensors counted them, while her hands were very still on the console, and her mind was working through numbers that did not resolve into anything good. Warships, transport vessels, hundreds of thousands of Vreth ground units in cryosuspension, orbital bombardment platforms that could turn the surface of a moon into glass. It was not a test. It was the Vreth's answer to a question they had not known could be asked, and their answer was everything. General Hosvar called the full command staff together, and the faces around the table told the story before anyone spoke. The conclave garrison at Kelos numbered just under 30,000. The human contingent was 10,000. Against what was coming, those numbers meant something only if they were used in a very particular way. Hosvar laid out the evacuation plan. It was a good plan. It preserved the most lives. It abandoned the station, but kept the people. And the people could form a new defensive line somewhere further back, as they had done before, as the Conclave had done a dozen times in 60 years of doing this. He asked Voss what the human contingent needed to begin withdrawal. Voss was looking at the fleet data on the main screen. She had been looking at it since it appeared, and she had not moved, except to occasionally trace a route or measurement with one finger without touching the display, just following the logic of something in her own head. She said, "We're not withdrawing." The room got very quiet, in the particular way that rooms get quiet, when someone has said the thing that everyone understood was coming, but nobody had wanted to hear out loud. Hosvar said, carefully, that the enemy force outnumbered the combined Kelos garrison by a ratio that made defense impossible. He said that to stay was to die, He said this as a fact, not an argument, because in his experience, facts were more useful than arguments in moments like this. Voss said, "They outnumber us, they don't outthink us." She turned from the screen and looked at the table. "We're not going to defend Kelos. We're going to make Kelos expensive. Expensive enough that the Hive does the math and decides this isn't worth what it costs." She started talking about the terrain, the debris fields in the outer ring of the system, where 3 old ships had been destroyed in a previous raid, and their wrecks drifted in loose, overlapping orbits. The narrow canyon systems on the moon's surface, where a large force lost its coordination advantage. The interior of the station itself, its corridors and maintenance shafts, and pressurized sections that could be sealed, vented, flooded with interference signals. She talked about the Vreth's tactical pattern, the commitment to an assault formation once launched, the slowness to re-optimize, and she talked about how to use that. She talked for 20 minutes without stopping, and by the time she finished, 2 of the Conclave officers were taking notes, and Hasvar had stopped looking at the evacuation plan. "You have done this before," Hasvar said. It was not a question. "Different enemy," Voss said. "Same math." The Vreth fleet arrived in the Kalos system 40 hours later. What followed was not the kind of battle that had a clear shape while it was happening. From inside the command post, it looked like noise, sensor data spiking and dropping, communication channels full of fragments, the lights flickering twice when something large hit the outer hull, then steadying. Cyreth tracked it in pieces, the way you track a storm by watching what it does to the things around you, rather than seeing the storm itself. The Vreth assault force moved in through the outer ring of the system and hit the debris field, where it should have had clear passage. Instead, it found things waiting in the wreckage. Humans had been in those drifting hulks for 30 hours, in vacuum suits with equipment that did not broadcast, doing what Cyreth's files had listed under the category of ambush, and what a Conclave officer at her side now described simply as they were inside the dead ships. They were already there. The Vreth lost 40 vessels in the debris field before they understood that the field was a killing zone, and pushed through by numbers alone. They came out the other side with their formation disrupted and their coordination fractured, and their assault pattern already running wrong, but they kept moving, because the Hive had committed, and the Hive did not stop. They hit the moon. They moved into the canyon systems with their ground forces, the enormous columns of Vreth infantry that had overwhelmed 100 defended positions on 100 worlds. The canyons narrowed, and the columns broke apart, and suddenly the things that were supposed to be in fortified positions defending a perimeter were everywhere and nowhere at the same time. In front of the Vreth, behind them, above them on the canyon walls, inside their own formations, cutting individual units out of the flow before the Hive could respond. The Vreth took the moon. It cost them more than they had ever paid for a moon. Inside the station, it was worse. The humans fought room to room, corridor to corridor, in the dark and in the smoke, and in sections that had been deliberately depressurized to slow the Vreth advance. They left things behind them as they pulled back. Not abandoned equipment, but deliberate ones. The kind of tools that a species 200,000 years into the business of killing other things builds specifically for the purpose of making pursuit expensive. It went on for 19 hours. At the end of it, the Vreth held Kelos Station. They had the ground. They had the corridors. They had the thing they had come to take. But out of the fleet that had come to take it, more than a third was gone. The ground force that had pushed through the moon's canyons had been reduced by nearly half. And somewhere, in the debris field, and the tunnels, and the dark corners of a station that humans had had 19 hours to prepare, the losses were still being counted. In the history of the Vreth Overmind, no target had ever cost this much. The Hive was still processing that, when Voss and the surviving humans, who had pulled back in organized, deliberate stages, not running, but choosing, broadcast a single short message on the Vreth communication frequency. The coordinates of the next defensive position, 3 systems back. A message said, "We'll be waiting." The Vreth overmind was silent for a long time. Then, for the first time in 3,000 years of unbroken forward advance, it gave an order that moved its forces in a direction other than forward. A Talvani officer in the evacuation fleet saw the Vreth fleet signatures on his screen change direction, and grabbed the nearest console with both hands to steady himself. He looked at the data 3 times, because he did not trust it the first 2. He turned to the officer beside him. "They're pulling back," he said. The officer beside him did not respond for a moment. Then she said, "That's not possible." The screen did not change. The Vreth were retreating. The word spread through conclave space, the way important things always spread, faster than it should have, carried by people who could not quite believe what they were saying. The Vreth had retreated, not regrouped, not paused, not pulled back to a secondary position to re-optimize before the next assault. They had turned their fleet around and moved away from the Kelos system, and every long-range sensor net in that region of space confirmed it. And the conclave analysts, who were paid to understand Vreth behavior, sat in their offices and looked at the data and could not explain it in any framework they had ever used before. In 60 years of war, the Vreth had never retreated from anything. The news reached the Conclave High Council in less than a day. It reached Valeth in less than 2. He sat with it for a long time, in his ship, in his chair, with the information on the screen in front of him, and a silence around him that felt like the silence after a very loud sound. The kind where your ears are still ringing, and you are not quite sure yet what broke. A meeting was arranged, not a small meeting. Every ambassador, every senior military commander, every analyst and strategist the conclave could gather, was called to a central station, 3 systems from Kalos, and they came quickly, because what had happened demanded an explanation, and explanations required the people who might have one. The humans were invited too. Voss arrived with 12 of her people. They had cleaned up since Kalos, but they still had the look of people who had recently been in a very hard place and come back from it intact. They sat down at a very long table in a very large room full of beings from 200 species, and the room was quieter than a room that size usually was. And the quiet had a specific quality to it that Sirith, sitting near the back, recognized after a moment. It was the quiet of people who were not sure how to behave around something they did not fully understand. The presentations came first. Analysis of the battle. The numbers, Vreth losses, human losses, conclave losses, equipment lost, ground lost, what it had cost, and what it had done. The analysts walked through it in the careful, systematic way of people trying to impose order on something that had not been orderly. They showed charts. They showed maps. They showed the trajectory of the Vreth fleet turning back on their sensor logs. Then they asked the humans to explain what had happened. She looked at the room for a moment. All of it. The hundreds of alien faces, the screens, the formal arrangement of a civilization trying to understand itself. And then she began to talk. She talked about terrain, about the debris field, and how long her people had been positioned in those wrecks before the Vreth arrived. About the canyon systems on the moon, and the way a narrow space breaks a large force into pieces that can be handled individually. About the 19 hours inside the station, and the difference between a retreat and a withdrawal, and why the distinction mattered. She talked about the Vreth's tactical weakness, the inability to re-optimize mid-assault, and how every decision her people made during the battle had been built around that single fact, pressing it, exploiting it, forcing the hive to run its program all the way to completion, even as the program became more expensive with every step. Sireth watched the faces and saw something she had not expected. Not relief, not gratitude. Something more complicated. A kind of careful attention that looked less like listening to a report and more like listening to something that they were trying to decide whether it was safe to be near. Valeth was at the far end of the table. He had not spoken yet. He had been quiet through all of it, sitting with his 4 hands folded and his gold eyes on Voss, with an expression Cyrith had never seen on his face before. When the formal presentation was done and the room opened for questions, he was the one who spoke first. He said, "We asked Earth for soldiers. What are you?" The room was very still. Voss looked at him for a moment. It was not an unfriendly look. It was the look of someone who had been asked a real question and was deciding how much of a real answer to give. "You asked for soldiers," she said, "because you needed something that follows orders and holds a line. That's what a soldier does. Stand in a position and hold it for as long as possible, and give ground slowly." She paused. "But humans have been fighting each other and everything else on our planet for 200,000 years. Before we had armies, we had hunters. Before we had tactics, we had instincts built up over thousands of generations of figuring out how to kill things that were bigger and faster and stronger than us." She looked around the room, not challenging, just looking. "We learned how to be patient in the dark. We learned how to read terrain. We learned how to make something fear us before it ever saw us." She leaned forward slightly. "You asked for soldiers because you wanted discipline and structure. And yes, we have that. But the people who volunteered for this, the ones who heard there was a war they'd never seen against an enemy they didn't know and put their names on a list anyway, those people weren't thinking about holding a line." She was quiet for a second. They were thinking about the problem, about how to solve it. That's a different kind of person. Valeth said, "And what kind of person is that?" Voss picked up the cup of coffee she had somehow acquired, because wherever Voss went, there was eventually coffee, and she took a sip, and she looked at the star map on the wall behind the council. The map with Vreth space marked in red, the long red stain of conquered territory, the 60 years of losing ground. "You wanted Earth's soldiers," she said. "Soldiers hold what they're given and hope it's enough." She set down the cup. "What you got is something different. What you got are people who looked at that map and started thinking about how to take it back." The room was quiet for a long time after that. Cyrith was watching Valeth. She saw the moment when something changed in his face. Not dramatically, not with any obvious shift, just a small settling, like a weight that had been held for a long time being set down. He had started all of this. He had gone to Earth looking for something to fill a gap in a defensive line. He had sat in a room with humans in suits and made a deal, and thought he understood what he was getting. He had not understood now. He looked at Voss for a long time. Then, slowly, he smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that reached his gold eyes, and it was the first time Cyrith had seen him smile since the war began. He said, "Then I suppose we should talk about the next step." And Voss said, "I've been thinking about that." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Actual paper, which she apparently carried with her, because of course she did. And she unfolded it on the table, and it was covered in handwritten notes and small diagrams and coordinates that several of the analysts near her immediately leaned in to look at. "The Vreth retreated because we made them afraid," Voss said. "Fear doesn't last forever. Right now their hive is processing something it's never processed before, and it doesn't know what to do with it. That window won't stay open." She smoothed the paper flat with her palm. "So here's what I think we should do while it's still open." She started talking about Vreth home systems, about approach vectors, about what the hive's fear response would look like as it translated into fleet movements, and how those movements could be anticipated, and what could be positioned along those anticipated routes before the hive recovered its direction. She talked about ending the war. Not managing it, not stabilizing it, ending it. Cyrith listened, and around her the room listened, and the faces of 200 species showed the same thing. That particular, careful attention again. The one that was trying to decide something. But now Cyrith could read it more clearly than she had before. It wasn't uncertainty about whether the humans were safe to be near. It was the expression of people who had been losing for a very long time, and had just heard someone describe, in plain and simple terms, what winning might look like. It was hope. Outside the station, in the cold between stars, the Vreth fleet was still moving away from Kalos. Still retreating. Still carrying in its hive mind the unprocessed weight of something it had encountered in the dark and not been able to name. On a small blue planet far away, millions of people who had put their names on a list were waiting to hear if they were needed. They were needed. They just didn't know yet how much.